So glad you're back. You're going to love today's story.
The day before the 100th anniversary gala, Vance Manor was a hive of expensive chaos. The sharp, citrus scent of high-grade floor wax competed with the cloying fragrance of 1,000 imported lilies being arranged in the foyer. Elena Vance stood on the mezzanine, her fingers tracing the cold, wrought-iron railing she had designed herself 3 years ago. The same railing her brother had claimed was his visionary contribution to the estate's restoration. Below her, Julian Vance was holding court with the lead caterer and 2 local reporters. He looked every bit the golden heir in his tailored navy blazer, his laughter echoing off the marble floors with a practiced, hollow warmth. He adjusted his heavy gold watch, the metal catching the light and throwing a jagged reflection against the wall. "We've spared no expense for tomorrow," Julian said, his voice carrying easily to the mezzanine. "The legacy of this house is built on excellence. It's a shame my sister doesn't quite grasp the scale of what we're doing here. She's always been more comfortable with the structural minutiae. The heavy lifting is for those of us who understand the Vance brand." One of the reporters chuckled, scribbling in a notebook. Elena didn't flinch. She felt the weight of the leather-bound folder tucked under her arm, a tactile reminder of the truth Julian was currently suffocating with his lies. She made her way down the stairs, her footsteps silent on the plush runner. As she reached the bottom, Julian turned, his smile sharpening into something predatory. "Ah, Elena, just the person I wanted to see," he said, not bothering to lower his voice. "The staff tells me you were poking around the accounting office again. I thought we agreed you'd stick to the garden arrangements. We wouldn't want you getting a headache over numbers you don't understand." "I was just ensuring everything is in order for the audit, Julian," she replied, her voice steady and quiet. "The audit is handled," he snapped, his eyes flashing with a brief, jagged spark of panic before the mask of arrogance slid back into place. "I've personally overseen the foundation's transfers. Why don't you go find Margaret? I believe she needs help deciding which silver service is least likely to remind the guests of your modest lifestyle." The reporters exchanged a look, and Elena saw the flicker of pity in their eyes. It was a familiar look, one she had lived with for a decade. Julian's enablers were everywhere, bought and paid for by a prestige that was currently rotting from the inside out. Arthur Vance emerged from the study then, his gait heavy, but his expression filled with pride as he looked at his son. He barely glanced at Elena as he reached out to clap Julian on the shoulder. "The board is impressed, son," Arthur said, his voice thick with the gravel of age and misplaced trust. "They're calling the new expansion the Julian Wing. It's about time this family had a leader who knows how to grow our capital instead of just spending it on blueprints and dust." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, velvet-lined box. Inside sat the Vance signet ring, the heavy gold seal of the family patriarch. "I was going to wait until the toast tomorrow, but I want you to wear this tonight, to show the staff who they're really working for." Julian took the ring, sliding it onto his finger with a smirk directed straight at Elena. "I won't let you down, father. Unlike some, I know the value of what we own." Elena felt a vibration in her pocket. She stepped back into the shadows of the hallway and pulled out her phone. A message from Sela's Thorn glowed on the screen. "The final lien has been transferred. You are now the sole owner of the Vance debt. Julian has officially signed the last of the collateral over to the shell company. He thinks he's getting a loan. He just gave you the house." She looked back at the foyer. Julian was gesturing wildly, describing a future for the estate that involved selling off the north acreage, land he didn't realize he no longer had the right to touch. "Julian," Elena said, stepping forward one last time. He sighed, exasperated. "What now, Elena? Can't you see we're busy?" "I just think you should be careful with the foundation's primary account tonight," she said, her voice laced with a subtle, icy edge. "There are some discrepancies. If you disclose them now, the board might be more lenient tomorrow." Julian let out a bark of laughter, a sound that tasted like iron and arrogance. "Discrepancies? You're projecting your own failures onto me. I'm the one saving this family while you play architect in the dirt. Go to bed, Elena. Tomorrow is a big day for the real Vances. Try not to ruin the photos with that miserable look on your face. Arthur nodded in agreement, turning his back on his daughter to follow Julian toward the dining room. Elena watched them go, the silence of the hallway closing in around her. She reached into her bag and touched the smooth, cold surface of the digital recorder Silas had prepared. Every word Julian had just spoken, every insult, every admission of overseeing the transfers, was now a permanent record of his own undoing. The countdown was no longer in days. It was in hours. Tomorrow night, in this very foyer, under the glow of the crystal chandeliers, and in front of every person Julian had ever tried to impress, the Julian wing would come crashing down. She turned and walked toward the back stairs, her heart beating with a calm, rhythmic precision. The day before the event was almost over, and Julian Vance had no idea he was already a guest in a house he didn't own. The next morning, the Vance estate smelled of floor wax and lilies, a frantic perfume for a house about to be gutted. Elena Vance found her parents in the sun-drenched breakfast nook, where the clink of silver against bone china sounded like tiny, sharp bells. Arthur didn't look up from his newspaper, but Margaret offered a tight, performative smile that failed to reach her eyes. The atmosphere was brittle, held together only by the weight of the family's unearned prestige. Julian Vance swept into the room a moment later, the heels of his Italian loafers clicking rhythmically on the hardwood. He didn't sit, he hovered, radiating the restless energy of a man who had already spent money he hadn't yet stolen. "Elena," he said, his voice light but edged with a familiar, casual cruelty. "I've decided your old drafting room is the perfect spot for the new humidor. I'll need your sketches cleared out by noon. The contractors are coming to measure during the gala." Elena took a slow sip of her tea, the rising steam warming her face. "The gala is tonight, Julian. You're inviting contractors to a black tie event." "I'm inviting investors," he corrected, leaning over the table to snatch a piece of toast from Arthur's plate. He moved with a predatory confidence, as if everything within these walls already belonged to him. "And investors want to see progress. They want to see the Julian wing expanding. Your little hobby projects are just cluttering the vision." "He's right, dear," Margaret added, smoothing a silk napkin that was already perfect. She didn't look at her daughter, focusing instead on the gold-rimmed sugar bowl. "It's time to be realistic. Julian is the future of this family's legacy. Your father and I have already signed over the management rights for that section of the house. It's better if you just fade into the background for a while. Try not to embarrass him tonight." Elena felt the familiar sting of their dismissal, but it was tempered by the weight of the flash drive tucked into her pocket. She looked at Arthur, hoping for a flicker of the man who used to teach her how to draw blueprints on napkins. He remained silent, his gaze fixed on the financial section of the Gazette. He was willfully blind, choosing the lie of his son's success over the reality of his daughter's sacrifice. An hour later, Elena met Silas Thorne in the shadowed corner of the library. The room smelled of old leather, and the faint, metallic scent of the digital recorder sitting on the desk between them. Silas looked older in the morning light, his expression grave as he slid a blue-backed document across the mahogany. "It's finalized," Silas whispered, his voice barely audible over the distant sound of caterers setting up in the foyer. "The bank processed the final buyout of the mortgage Julian defaulted on. Since you used your architectural firm's holdings to cover the debt, the title didn't revert to the family trust. It stayed with you." Elena ran her thumb over the raised seal on the paper, the texture rough and official. For 5 years, she had worked 80-hour weeks, pouring every cent of her firm's profits into the Vance Preservation Fund. Her parents thought the money came from Julian's mysterious investments. In reality, Julian had been draining the estate's coffers to fund a gambling addiction that spanned 3 continents, while Elena had been secretly buying back the family's life, piece by piece, to keep them from the street. "He thinks he's unveiling a wing named after himself tonight," she said, her voice a calm, steady blade. "He's unveiling a house of cards," Silas replied. The moment he signs that partnership agreement with the Vance name, he'll be committing fraud. He doesn't have the authority to pledge the estate as collateral. You do. Elena looked out the window. In the driveway, a van was unloading crates of champagne. Cassie Vance was outside, playing near the fountain, oblivious to the storm her father had summoned. Elena felt a pang of guilt for the girl, but it was quickly eclipsed by the memory of Julian's smirk at breakfast. 6 hours, Silas, Elena said. 6 hours, he agreed. The countdown had shifted from days to minutes. Tonight, the Julian wing wouldn't just be measured, it would be reclaimed. Elena tucked the deed into her bag, the paper crisp and final. Julian Vance had no idea he was about to lose the only thing he actually valued, his reflection in other people's eyes. 2 days had passed since the ink had dried on the most expensive mistake of Julian's life. Elena stood in the shadow of the grand staircase, her fingers grazing the cool, polished mahogany of the banister. The house smelled of lilies and floor wax, a funeral masquerading as a celebration. Upstairs, she could hear her brother's booming laughter, a sound that usually made her retreat into the walls like a ghost. Today, it was merely a signal that the clock was ticking. She had spent the morning in Silas Thorne's office, a space that felt more like a sanctuary than the home she'd been born into. The attorney had handed her a single, embossed folder with a gravity that made the air in the room feel thin. Inside was the confirmation. Julian had officially pledged the Vance estate as collateral for a $20 million development loan. He had signed his name with the flourish of a king, unaware that the crown he claimed was made of glass. He thinks the bank is his partner now, Silas had whispered, his eyes sharp behind his spectacles. He doesn't realize the bank is simply the messenger, and you, Elena, are the one holding the message. Now, back at the estate, she watched as the staff prepared the dining hall for a private celebratory dinner. Julian had invited the local elite to toast his visionary leadership. He was at the peak of his arrogance, a man who believed his own lies so thoroughly that the truth had become an alien language. "There she is," a voice sneered from the landing above. Elena looked up to see Julian descending the stairs. He was dressed in a tailored navy suit that likely cost more than the car she'd driven for 6 years. He adjusted his cufflinks, the gold catching the afternoon light. Behind him, Arthur and Margaret followed like a royal court, their faces glowing with the reflected light of their son's supposed success. "Still lurking in the corners, I see," Julian said, his voice carrying easily to the catering staff below. He stopped 3 steps above her, ensuring he could look down at her. "I'd tell you to go change for dinner, but I'm not sure we have any rags in the attic that would suit your aesthetic." Arthur chuckled, a dry, papery sound. "Now, Julian, be kind. Your sister is just overwhelmed by the scale of what you've achieved. It's a lot for a simple architect to process." "Simple is the word for it," Margaret added, her eyes scanning Elena with a clinical, disappointing coldness. She reached out to straighten Julian's lapel, her touch lingering with a pride she had never once shown her daughter. "Tonight is about the future of the Vance name. Try to stay out of the way, dear. We wouldn't want the investors thinking the family lacks polish." Elena felt the familiar sting, the old rage that used to make her throat tighten. But today, the sensation was different. It was fuel. She reached into her bag, her fingers brushing the edge of the folder Silas had given her. The weight of it was a secret power, a silent promise of the storm to come. "I'll be sure to stay exactly where I belong," Elena said, her voice a calm, steady ribbon of ice. Julian stepped onto the foyer floor, invading her personal space. The scent of his expensive, woodsy cologne was suffocating. He leaned in, his smile not reaching his eyes. "You know, I almost feel sorry for you. While I'm building empires, you're still counting bricks. After tonight, when the partnership is announced, I might find a small office for you in the basement of the new wing. You can design the bathrooms." He laughed, a sharp, entitled bark, and walked toward the dining room. He didn't wait for a response. He never did. He assumed the world would simply rearrange itself to fit his whims. Elena watched them go. She saw Margaret whisper something to Arthur, and they both smiled, their backs turned to the daughter who had quietly paid the taxes, fixed the roof, and kept the estate from crumbling while their son gambled away their legacy. She walked toward the library, her footsteps silent on the Persian rug. Inside, the room was dim, the air heavy with the scent of old leather. She sat at the heavy oak desk, the one Julian claimed was his now, and opened the folder. The legal documents were clear. By pledging the estate without the consent of the actual title holder, Julian hadn't just been ambitious, he had been criminal. The door creaked open and Cassie peeked in. The young girl looked tired, her eyes wide and searching. She saw Elena and hesitated. "Is Daddy going to be famous now?" Cassie asked, her voice small. Elena looked at her niece, the only Vance who hadn't yet been poisoned by the family's obsession with status. She felt a pang of protectiveness. "He's going to be remembered, Cassie, but fame is a tricky thing. He said we're going to move to a bigger house soon," the girl whispered. "But I like this one." "It feels like you." Elena beckoned her over, tucking a stray hair behind the girl's ear. "This house isn't going anywhere, I promise, no matter what your father says." A loud crash echoed from the foyer. A server had dropped a tray of crystal flutes. Julian's voice erupted in a flurry of insults, his temper flaring at the slightest imperfection. The sound made Cassie flinch. Elena's grip tightened on the folder. The countdown had moved past hours and into the final, inevitable approach. The gala was 48 hours away. 2 days until the Julian wing was revealed to be a monument to a man who owned nothing but the air he used to brag. She stood up, her resolve hardening into something unbreakable. Julian thought he was the master of this house, but he was merely a tenant in a building Elena had already reclaimed. As she walked toward the window, watching the sun set over the acres of land that Julian had unknowingly signed over to her legal control, she felt a sense of peace. The trap was no longer just set. The spring was under tension, and Julian was currently dancing on the trigger. She would let him have his dinner. She would let him drink his expensive champagne and bask in the hollow praise of his peers. Because in 2 days, the silence that followed his fall would be the only sound left in the house. Elena looked at the clock on the mantel. 47 hours and 50 minutes. She could wait. After a lifetime of being overlooked, she had learned that the most satisfying justice was the kind that arrived exactly when the villain felt most invincible. The following afternoon, the sun hung low over the Vance estate, casting long, skeletal shadows across the manicured lawn. Elena Vance stood on the stone terrace, her fingers tracing the cool, pebbled surface of the leather portfolio tucked under her arm. Inside were the final filings from Sela's Thorn, the documents that officially stripped the mask from the man currently laughing at the far end of the garden. Julian Vance stood near the fountain, his posture radiating the easy, unearned confidence of a king who didn't realize his throne was made of ice. He was gesturing wildly toward the east wing of the house, holding court for Arthur and Margaret. The scent of Julian's expensive, wood-heavy cologne drifted toward the terrace, a cloying reminder of the lifestyle he'd maintained on the back of Elena's silent labor. "We'll tear down the conservatory first," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the grass. "It's wasted space. I've already spoken to the developers. We're going to put in a private lounge and a high-stakes billiards room. This house needs to start reflecting my success, not just the past." Elena felt a sharp pang of indignation. That conservatory was her masterpiece, the first thing she had designed for the family after finishing her degree. She stepped off the terrace, the gravel crunching beneath her heels with a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. "The conservatory is structurally integral to that wing, Julian," she said, her voice steady and quiet as she approached the group. He didn't even turn his head fully, merely offering a dismissive flick of his wrist. "Structure is for the people I hire to worry about, Elena. You've always been too focused on the small things. That's why you're an architect and I'm the one actually running the Vance legacy." Arthur Vance nodded, his pride in his son blinding him to the arrogance in the younger man's tone. "He's got a vision, Elena. You should try to be more supportive." Tomorrow's gala is a celebration of the stability Julian has brought back to this family. "Stability," she repeated, the word tasting like ash. She looked directly at her brother. The gold signet ring on his finger caught the light as he adjusted his silk tie, a ring that had belonged to their grandfather, which Julian had found after it went missing from the safe 3 years ago. "Julian, before the gala tomorrow, I want to give you one chance. Just one. Tell Dad the truth about the bridge loans and the offshore accounts. If you do it now in private, maybe the fallout won't be as public." The laughter stopped. Julian turned to face her, his eyes narrowing into slits of pure contempt. He stepped into her personal space, the smell of whiskey and peppermint on his breath. "You've always been jealous," he hissed, low enough so Arthur and Margaret couldn't hear. "But this is pathetic, even for you. You think a few whispered lies are going to topple me? I am the one who saved this estate. I am the one the board answers to. You're just a guest in this house because I'm generous enough to let you stay." He reached out and tapped the leather portfolio she held against her chest. "Go back to your little drawings, Elena. Leave the real power to the men who know how to wield it." Margaret Vance stepped forward, placing a hand on Julian's arm, her face tight with disapproval as she looked at her daughter. "Elena, stop upsetting your brother. He's under enough pressure as it is. Why must you always try to ruin his moments?" The injustice of it was a physical weight, a cold pressure in Elena's chest. She looked at her mother, then at her father, seeing the way they moved to shield Julian from the slightest hint of accountability. They had chosen their side long ago. "I'm not trying to ruin anything," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that felt more dangerous than a scream. "I'm giving you a warning. Foundations built on sand don't just shift, Julian. They collapse. And when they do, they take everyone inside with them." Julian barked a laugh, the sound sharp and ugly in the quiet garden. "I'll take my chances. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have a celebration to prepare for. Try to find something to wear tomorrow that doesn't look like you bought it at a clearance sale. It's a Vance event, after all. Try to look like you belong." He turned his back on her, dismissing her existence with a casual shrug as he led their parents toward the house. Elena stood alone on the lawn, her hand tightening on the documents that proved she didn't just belong in the house, she owned the land beneath his feet. 24 hours. The spring was fully coiled. Tomorrow, when the lights were brightest and the witnesses were most numerous, Julian would finally learn that the sister he had stepped on to reach the top was the only thing that had been keeping him from the fall. She turned and walked toward the gate, not looking back. She had a final meeting with Silas, and for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of the dark. The evening of the Vance Centennial Gala arrived with a suffocating elegance, the air inside the grand ballroom thick with the scent of 3,000 white lilies and the cloyingly sweet aroma of vintage champagne. Crystal chandeliers cast fractured, diamond-bright light across the sea of tuxedos and silk gowns, creating a shimmering facade that masked the rot beneath the family name. Elena Vance stepped through the arched mahogany doors, her presence a silent ripple in the pond of practiced smiles. She wasn't wearing the clearance rack rags her brother had anticipated. Instead, she wore a floor-length gown of midnight blue silk that clung to her frame like a second skin, its deep hue making her eyes look like flint. She felt the weight of the slim leather portfolio tucked under her arm, a hidden blade in a room full of blunt instruments. Silas Thorne was waiting near the towering ice sculpture in the foyer, his expression as unreadable as a closed ledger. He didn't speak as she approached, merely offering a curt, respectful nod. He handed her a glass of sparkling water, his fingers grazing hers in a silent signal of readiness. The documents were filed. The trap was set. "You look like you're attending a funeral, Silas," she murmured, her voice low and steady. "In a way, I am," he replied, his gaze shifting toward the center of the room. There, Julian Vance stood at the heart of a circle of the city's most influential investors, his laughter loud and gratingly confident. He looked every bit the golden sun, his tailored suit fitting his ego as perfectly as his frame. He was holding court, gesturing expansively with a crystal flute as he spun a tale of the new era he was about to usher in for the Vance estate. Arthur Vance stood at his shoulder, his chest puffed out with a pride he hadn't earned, while Margaret Vance beamed at the socialites surrounding them, her diamonds catching the light with every practiced tilt of her head. Julian spotted her then. He didn't even try to hide the flicker of annoyance that crossed his face before he masked it with a sneer of amused contempt. He excused himself from the group and sauntered toward her, his stride radiating the unearned authority of a man who believed he owned the very air he breathed. "I have to hand it to you, Elena," Julian said, his voice carrying just enough to ensure the nearby board members heard. "You actually managed to look presentable. Who did you have to beg for the loaner? Or did you finally dip into the petty cash I'm sure you've been skimming?" The sting of the insult was familiar, but today it lacked its usual bite. Elena didn't flinch. She took a slow sip of her water, watching him over the rim of the glass. The cold condensation on the crystal felt grounding against her palm. "It's a beautiful event, Julian," she said, her voice like silk over stone. "You've certainly spent a lot of other people's money to make yourself look successful." His jaw tightened, the mask of the charming host slipping for a fraction of a second. "Careful. I'm in a generous mood tonight because of the announcement, but don't think I won't have security escort you to the service entrance. You're here as a courtesy, a ghost of the past. Try to stay in the shadows where you belong." He turned his back on her before she could respond, returning to his circle of sycophants. The dismissal was calculated, a public reminder of her perceived insignificance. She watched him go, noticing how Arthur clapped him on the back, whispering something that made Julian throw his head back in a triumphant roar of laughter. The sound of a string quartet vibrated through the soles of her shoes, the cello's low hum echoing the tension coiling in her gut. She scanned the room and found Cassie Vance sitting near the edge of the ballroom. The girl looked small in her expensive lace dress, her eyes darting nervously toward her father. Julian didn't look at his daughter once. She was just another prop in the theater of his greatness. Arthur stepped toward the small dais at the front of the room, tapping a silver spoon against his glass. The chime cut through the chatter, bringing a sudden, expectant silence to the hall. "Friends, colleagues," Arthur began, his voice thick with emotion. "Tonight we celebrate a century of the Vance legacy, but more importantly, we celebrate the man who saved it. When the shadows grew long and the wolves were at the door, my son, Julian, stepped up. He secured the future of this estate when others." He paused, his gaze drifting momentarily to Elena with a look of cold disappointment. "Were merely distractions. Tonight, Julian will sign the final merger that cements our dominance for the next 100 years." A smattering of applause broke out. Julian stepped onto the dais, basking in the spotlight like a predator in the sun. He looked out over the crowd, his eyes finding Elena S. He offered her a slow, mocking wink before reaching for the gold pen resting on the podium. "Before I sign," Julian said, his voice amplified by the room's perfect acoustics, "I want to thank those who truly mattered, to my father for trusting me, to the board for seeing the vision, and to my sister, Elena. Thank you for staying out of the way long enough for a man to get the job done." A ripple of polite, cruel laughter moved through the guests. Margaret smirked behind her fan. The humiliation was complete, served on a silver platter in front of everyone who mattered in their world. Elena felt the leather of the portfolio under her arm. It was smooth, cool, and heavy with the weight of the truth. She caught Silas's eye across the room. He gave a microscopic nod and began to move toward the side of the stage, his hand reaching into his coat for the injunction papers. Julian leaned over the document, the pen poised above the signature line. The cameras of the local press flashed, capturing the moment of his supposed victory. He was seconds away from signing away a legacy he didn't own, to a company that didn't realize they were buying a hollow shell. "Wait," Elena said. It wasn't a shout. It was a calm, clear command that sliced through the celebratory atmosphere like a razor through silk. The room went unnervingly still. Julian froze, the pen a fraction of an inch from the paper. He looked up, his face reddening with a mixture of confusion and burgeoning rage. "Elena, sit down," Arthur hissed from the side of the stage, his face contorted in embarrassment. She didn't sit. She walked forward, the crowd parting for her as if she were a ghost passing through walls. Her heels clicked with rhythmic finality against the marble floor. She reached the base of the dais and looked up at her brother, who was staring down at her with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You're about to sign a contract for land you don't possess, Julian," she said, her voice reaching every corner of the silent ballroom. Julian let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "You've finally lost it. Someone get her out of here." Two security guards began to move from the doors, but Sela's thorn stepped into their path, holding up a single finger. He didn't say a word, but the authority in his posture stopped them cold. Elena placed the leather portfolio on the edge of the stage. She didn't open it yet. She just let it sit there, a black box of secrets under the bright lights of the chandeliers. The socialites leaned forward, their champagne forgotten. The board members exchanged frantic, whispered glances. "The centennial celebration is over," Elena said, her gaze locked on Julian's trembling hand. "The real show is just beginning." Elena Vance didn't move as Julian lunged for the leather portfolio. Sela's thorn stepped forward, his hand a firm, immovable barrier against her brother's chest. The ballroom, once a cacophony of clinking crystal and polite laughter, had fallen into a silence so profound it felt physical. The air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the faint, ozone tang of the overhead stage lights. "Sit down, Julian," Sela said, his voice a low rumble that carried more authority than Julian's panicked shouting. Julian Vance stumbled back, his eyes wild and bloodshot. "This is a stunt. She's always been jealous. Father, tell the security to drag her out of here before she ruins the signing." Arthur Vance didn't move. He sat in the front row, his face a mask of dawning horror as he stared at the screen Elena had just activated. High-resolution scans of private ledgers filled the massive display behind the dais. The numbers were staggering. Millions of dollars funneled through shell companies to cover Julian's gambling losses in Macau and Vegas. Julian's face underwent a violent, public transformation. The arrogant smirk he had worn like armor for decades didn't just fade. It shattered. His skin, usually a tanned mask of expensive vacations and leisure, drained to a sickly, translucent gray. A single, frantic pulse throbbed in his temple, and his eyes, once sharp with predatory confidence, began to dart around the room like a trapped animal. His jaw went slack, his lower lip trembling almost imperceptibly as the first bead of cold sweat broke from his hairline and traced a slow, jagged path down his cheek. He looked suddenly aged, the hollows beneath his eyes deepening into bruised shadows as the weight of his own lies finally crushed him. He reached for the podium to steady himself, but his hands were shaking too violently to find purchase. "Those are forgeries," Julian screamed, but the sound was thin, lacking its usual bite. "The signatures were verified by 3 independent forensic analysts, Julian," Elena said. Her voice was calm, a sharp contrast to his frantic energy. She felt the cool, smooth weight of the final deed in her hand. "You didn't just take credit for my architectural designs. You tried to sell the very ground we're standing on to cover your debts. You thought I was the quiet one, the one who would just fade into the background while you played the visionary hero." Margaret Vance let out a sharp, choked sob from the front row. She looked at her son as if seeing a stranger for the first time, her hand clutching her pearls so tightly the string looked ready to snap. Beside her, Cassie Vance stood frozen, her eyes shimmering with tears of shock. The board members, men who had spent the last hour praising Julian's leadership, were already whispering, their bodies physically recoiling from him as if his failure were contagious. "I saved this family," Julian hissed, leaning over the podium, his knuckles white. "I kept the name alive while you hid in your office." "No," Elena replied, stepping closer so only he could see the absolute lack of pity in her eyes. "You fed on the name until there was nothing left but the shell. I'm the one who spent 5 years buying back every piece of our history you sold behind Father's back." She pulled the final document from the folder, the original deed to the Vance estate, bearing her name as the sole owner. She didn't hand it to him. She held it up for the room to see. The collective gasp of the socialites sounded like a rushing wind. "The centennial is over," she announced, her voice echoing off the marble walls and reaching every corner of the silent ballroom. "And so is your tenure in this house. You have nothing left to sign." Julian reached out, his fingers clawing at the air, but he looked small now, a child caught in a lie too big to manage. He tried to speak, but only a dry, rattling sound came out of his throat. He looked toward Arthur, but his father turned his head away, his shoulders slumped in a posture of total defeat. Elena didn't wait for the security to arrive or for the inevitable legal fallout to begin. She had spent 5 years in the shadows, building a fortress while Julian burned the palace. She turned and walked down the dais, the sharp, rhythmic click of her heels the only sound in the cavernous room. She didn't look back at her mother's tears or her brother's public collapse. She walked through the heavy oak doors and into the cool night air, leaving the wreckage of the Vance legacy behind her. The silence that followed the heavy thud of the oak doors was more deafening than the revelation itself. For a heartbeat, the air in the ballroom felt thin, ionized by the shock of the bank records still glowing on the massive projector screen. Julian stood frozen at the head of the long table, his fingers still curled as if he were holding the phantom glass of champagne he had dropped moments before. The dark stain of the spilled vintage was spreading across the white linen, a Rorschach test of his own ruin. He looked around the room, his eyes darting from one stony face to another. His face was no longer the mask of calculated arrogance he'd worn for years. It had curdled into something unrecognizable, a sickly, mottled gray that made the sweat on his forehead stand out like oil. His eyes, usually sharp with predatory intent, were wide and unfocused, darting toward the exit Elena had just vanished through. His lower lip trembled, a rhythmic twitch that he couldn't suppress no matter how hard he clenched his jaw. He looked like a man who had stepped off a cliff and was only now realizing there was no ground beneath him. His shoulders, usually thrown back in a posture of unearned victory, had slumped inward, making him look suddenly, pathetically small. "It's a lie," he croaked, the sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. He looked toward Arthur, his voice rising in a frantic, jagged pitch. "Father, you know her. She's always been jealous. She's been planning this. She's been cooking these books for years just to spite me. It's a forgery. She's a thief." Arthur Vance didn't move. He sat at the center of the table, his gaze fixed on the screen where Julian's signature appeared next to a wire transfer for $3 million to a casino in Macau. The pride that had defined the older man's posture for decades seemed to have evaporated, leaving behind a hollowed-out shell. "The signatures are verified, Julian," Silas Thorne said, his voice cutting through the room with the clinical coldness of a scalpel. The attorney stood at the end of the table, his hands folded neatly over a leather-bound folder. He didn't look at Julian with anger, but with a profound, weary disgust. "I spent the last 6 months working with the forensic accountants Elena hired. Every transaction, every shell company, every consulting fee you paid yourself from the estate's maintenance fund, it's all been traced. The legal reality is quite simple. You have spent 5 years systematically embezzling from a trust you no longer have any claim to." "You're on her side," Julian spat, lunging toward the table. "I'll have your license for this, Silas. You're fired. Get out of this house." "Actually," Silas replied, not even flinching as Julian's shadow fell over him, "I represent the majority shareholder of the Vance Holdings Group. That shareholder is Elena. And as of 20 minutes ago, when the final documents were filed, she has revoked your access to all corporate and personal accounts associated with the estate." The sound of a sharp gasp came from Margaret. She was standing near the windows, her hand pressed to her throat. She looked at Julian as if he were a stranger, a contagion she had accidentally invited into her home. When Julian turned to her, his eyes pleading, she didn't step forward. She pulled her silk shawl tighter around her shoulders and looked away, toward the dark gardens outside. "Mother, tell them," Julian pleaded, his voice cracking. "Tell them she's crazy. She's just a charity case we took in she has no right to." "Enough!" Arthur's voice wasn't a shout, but the weight of it silenced the room. He stood up slowly, his joints popping in the quiet. He looked at his son, and for the first time, the favoritism that had blinded him for 30 years was gone, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. She didn't take anything from you, Julian. You threw it away. You gambled with your daughter's future and your sister's life. I did it for the family, Julian yelled, his face turning a frantic, blotchy red. I was trying to grow the legacy. She's the one who betrayed us. She's the one who went behind our backs. She saved us, Arthur whispered. While you were burning the house down for warmth, she was rebuilding the foundation in the dark. The heavy double doors at the back of the room opened again, but it wasn't Elena. Two men in dark suits stepped inside, their presence professional and immovable. The metallic clink of their belts and the heavy tread of their boots on the marble floor signaled the end of the fantasy. Mr. Vance, the lead guard said, looking directly at Julian. We've been instructed to escort you from the premises. You have 10 minutes to gather personal essentials from your room. A courier will deliver the rest of your belongings to a designated location tomorrow. You can't do this, Julian hissed, backing away toward the wall. This is my house. My name is on the gate. Actually, Silas Thorne said, picking up a single sheet of paper from the table and holding it out. The deed was transferred to the trust 6 months ago. The trust is managed by Elena, and she has been very clear about the terms of your departure. Julian looked at the paper, then at the guards, then back at his father. Arthur wouldn't meet his eyes. The board members, men who had laughed at Julian's jokes and toasted his genius only an hour ago, were busy checking their phones, already distancing themselves from the wreckage. Julian's bravado finally snapped. He didn't go out with a roar. He went out with a whimper, a frantic, incoherent rambling about lawyers and revenge that no one was listening to. As the guards took his arms, he looked back one last time, his eyes searching for Cassie. But his daughter was nowhere to be seen. She had left with Elena, stepping out of the shadow of his lies and into a world he no longer owned. The room remained silent long after the sound of Julian's protests faded down the hallway. The projector hummed, the only sound in the cavernous space, casting a cold, blue light over the empty chairs. The Vance legacy hadn't fallen. It had simply changed hands, leaving the pretender with nothing but the scent of stale champagne and the cold reality of the night. 6 months had passed since the glass-walled boardroom had become the site of Julian Vance's public execution. The scandal had been a slow-motion car crash that the local tabloids had feasted on for weeks, but for Elena Vance, the noise had finally faded into a productive, rhythmic silence. She stood on the north terrace of the estate, the scent of fresh cedar and lemon-scented floor wax clinging to her skin. The house no longer felt like a mausoleum of secrets. It felt like a living thing. The scaffolding was gone, the dry rot replaced by sturdy oak, and the architectural plans she had once drawn in secret were now the very walls surrounding her. She ran a hand over the restored balustrade, feeling the smooth, cool grain. It was hers, not by birthright or favoritism, but by the sheer force of her own labor and the legal documents Silas Thorne had finalized 3 weeks ago. The transition hadn't been without its jagged edges. Elena turned as she heard the crunch of gravel. A sleek black sedan pulled up the drive, and Silas stepped out, carrying a leather briefcase that looked as heavy as the news he usually delivered. "The final liquidation is complete," he said, skipping the pleasantries as he joined her on the terrace. He looked older, the lines around his eyes etched deeper by the months of litigation. "The penthouse is gone." The cars, the club memberships, the offshore accounts Julian thought were invisible, all cleared to settle the debts he racked up in your father's name. Elena looked out over the rolling green hills of the property. "And Julian?" "He's in a 1-bedroom walk-up in the industrial district," Silas replied, his voice devoid of sympathy. "He tried to sue for a monthly stipend from the estate, claiming emotional distress. The judge laughed him out of the chamber. He's currently working as a junior clerk for a firm that handles bankruptcy filings. The irony wasn't lost on the court. The image of Julian Vance, a man who once spent $5,000 on a single dinner, filing paperwork for people who had lost everything, brought a cold flash of satisfaction to her chest. It wasn't just that he had lost. It was that he was finally forced to see the world from the bottom up. "He called me yesterday," a new voice joined them. Arthur Vance stepped through the French doors, leaning heavily on a cane. The prideful lion of a man had been replaced by a shadow. His suits, once tailored to perfection, now hung loose on his frame. He wouldn't look Elena in the eye, his gaze fixed instead on the horizon. "He asked for money, Elena," he sounded, small. "Did you give it to him?" she asked, her voice level. "No," Arthur said, and for the first time he looked at her. There was a profound, aching regret in his eyes, a realization that he had spent decades nurturing a viper while trying to starve his only source of strength. "I told him he should be grateful he isn't in a cell. I told him to talk to his sister." "He won't do that," Elena said. "He knows I don't negotiate with ghosts." The cost of her victory sat between them like a physical weight. Margaret Vance was rarely seen these days, having retreated into a world of migraines and darkened rooms, unable to face a social circle that now whispered behind her back. The family name had been saved, but the family itself was a collection of broken pieces. Elena had the house, the legacy, and the career she had always dreamed of, but the dinner table remained half empty. Later that afternoon, Elena found herself in the city, driven by a lingering, morbid curiosity. She sat in her car across from a drab, gray building near the train tracks. The air here tasted of grit and diesel exhaust. At 5:02 p.m., the heavy steel door opened, and a man stepped out. Julian looked unrecognizable. His hair, once perfectly coiffed, was thinning and dull. He wore a cheap, polyester suit that sat stiffly on his shoulders, the sleeves frayed at the cuffs. He carried a plastic bag with a single frozen dinner inside. As he walked toward the bus stop, he tripped slightly on an uneven paving stone, and the arrogant sneer that had once defined his face was replaced by a look of sheer, exhausted defeat. He looked at his watch, a basic plastic thing that had replaced his Rolex, and slumped onto the bench, staring at his shoes. He looked up for a moment, his eyes scanning the street. Elena sat behind the tinted glass of her SUV, invisible to him. For a heartbeat, their eyes might have met, but he saw only his own reflection in the dark window. He looked away, his shoulders shaking with a cough that sounded wet and hollow. Elena signaled the driver to move on. She had expected to feel a surge of triumph, but instead she felt a quiet, stony finality. The debt was paid. When she returned to the estate, the sun was dipping below the trees, casting long, golden shadows across the lawn. Cassie Vance was sitting on the porch steps, a sketchbook open on her knees. The girl looked up and smiled, a genuine, unburdened expression that Julian had never been able to produce. "I finished the design for the new garden wing," Cassie said, holding up the book. Elena sat beside her, looking at the bold, clean lines her niece had drawn. It was a beginning. The Vance name wouldn't be defined by Julian's greed or Arthur's pride anymore. It would be defined by the women who had survived them. She looked back at the great house, its windows glowing with warm light. She had won everything, but as she watched the stars begin to pierce the purple sky, she realized the greatest victory wasn't the deed in the safe or the brother in the gutter. It was the fact that for the first time in her life, she wasn't waiting for someone else to tell her she belonged. She was home, and the silence was finally hers to fill.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.